James Howell Howard was born in 1913 in Canton, China. The son of an American ophthalmologist working abroad, his earliest memories were not of wide American fields or quiet small-town streets, but of foreign skies, crowded ports, the hum of different languages. Even as a boy, he was drawn to the sound of engines, watching primitive aircraft buzz overhead when missionaries or businessmen flew in on rattling machines. His fascination with flight grew naturally from those moments. He imagined himself one day at the controls, above the world, free from boundaries that pressed upon the ground. When his family returned to the United States, that dream followed him, strengthened by the rapid rise of aviation in the 20s and 30s. The exploits of Lindbergh and other pioneers filled newspapers, and James devoured every line. He knew his path was set. At university, he studied science, but his heart was elsewhere. He joined the Navy in the 1930s, drawn to the promise of the skies, and soon found himself training as a naval aviator. The first time he sat in the cockpit of a trainer, the earth dropping away beneath him, he felt the certainty that he belonged there. The roar of the engine, the vibration through the stick, the sudden vastness of sky, all fused into a calling. His instructors noted his calm under pressure, his analytical mind, his precision in maneuvers. He was not reckless. He was disciplined, calculating, aware that balance would one day define him. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, Howard watched from across the ocean with growing unease. He understood that America might one day be drawn in, but waiting idly was not his nature. By 1941, he made a fateful decision. He resigned his Navy commission and volunteered for the American Volunteer Group, the famed Flying Tigers preparing to defend China against Japanese aggression. It was a return of sorts, back to the land of his childhood, but now with wings and a purpose. The AVG trained him in Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, rugged aircraft with shark mouths painted on their noses, machines that demanded strength and skill. Howard adapted quickly. In China, he fought in skies thick with danger, facing experienced Japanese pilots in nimble aircraft. There he learned lessons that would guide him forever. Never rely on numbers, never waste ammunition, and always know your escape path. He became an ace with the Tigers, scoring victories while surviving desperate odds. More importantly, he discovered the importance of morale. The Chinese on the ground looked to the Tigers as symbols of hope, and Howard felt that responsibility keenly. He was not fighting only for himself, but for those who had no weapons of their own. That sense of duty would never leave him. When the Flying Tigers disbanded and America entered the war officially after Pearl Harbor, Howard returned to the United States. He joined the Army Air Forces, transitioning to the new and formidable P-51 Mustang. The sleek fighter represented the cutting edge of American aviation, a machine that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, something desperately needed as the Allies prepared for assaults on Germany itself. Howard embraced the Mustang's power with the same discipline he had shown since his first flights. He studied its performance obsessively, knowing every strength and weakness, rehearsing tactics until they were second nature. For him, mastery was not arrogance but survival. By 1943, he was stationed in England with the 354th Fighter Group, tasked with protecting the massive formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that struck at the heart of the Reich. Each mission was a test of endurance, hours of flight across hostile skies, waiting for the inevitable black specks of German fighters to appear. Howard's leadership qualities soon earned him command responsibilities. He was respected not because he shouted, but because he remained steady. His men trusted him, knew that he calculated risks carefully, knew that if he said something could be done, it could be. What drove him was not glory or thrill, but a relentless sense of responsibility. He had seen war in China, seen civilians bombed, seen villages burnt. He carried those images into every mission. For him, protecting the bombers meant protecting the crews inside, young men who placed their lives in the hands of escorts like him. That conviction hardened his resolve, sharpened his focus. He would not abandon them. And when the moment came in January 1944, when hundreds of bombers faced destruction and he alone was in position to intervene, that conviction would define his every action. England in late 1943 was a fortress of preparation. Airfields stretched across the countryside, their runways crowded with silver bombers and sleek fighters. The sound of engines rolling like thunder over villages that had grown accustomed to the war above them. James Howell Howard arrived into this world of constant tension with the 354th Fighter Group, one of the first units to fly the new P-51 Mustang in combat. The Mustang, with its long range and powerful Merlin engine, was the answer the Allies had searched for, capable of escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany and back again. Howard recognized immediately that this aircraft was different, a machine that combined speed, agility, and endurance in a way no other fighter could match. To him, it felt like the culmination of all he had learned with the Navy and the Flying Tigers: strength, precision, and patience fused into one weapon. His first missions were long escorts across the Channel, hours of monotony punctuated by seconds of terror. Bomber crews learned to recognize the Mustangs with gratitude, cheering over radios when they saw them overhead. Howard kept his squadron disciplined, stressing formation integrity and fuel management. He knew that recklessness killed more pilots than enemy fire. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109S and Focke-Wulf FW-190S, came at the bombers in packs, disciplined, aggressive, well-led. Howard drilled his men to counter with calm precision, not charging blindly but cutting angles, disrupting attacks, striking only when advantage was certain. He knew that his job was not to chase glory but to keep bombers alive. Every fortress that returned home was proof of success. In those weeks, he built a reputation. Pilots spoke of his calm even when tracer fire lit the sky, of his steady voice on the radio, of his refusal to panic. He was not flamboyant like some aces who relished daring duels. He was methodical, more surgeon than gambler. Yet that very steadiness gave his men confidence. They would follow him into the fire because they knew he would not waste them. Howard himself kept his emotions guarded, but in private moments he thought often of China, of civilians who had looked skyward with hope when the Flying Tigers appeared. Now he felt the same weight from the crews of bombers. Men locked inside metal fortresses, vulnerable without their escorts. He remembered villages burned, women and children huddled in fear. And he knew that defeating Germany meant preventing such destruction from spreading further. These were his motives, deeper than duty, rooted in experiences he could not forget. By January 1944, the campaign of daylight bombing over Germany was intensifying. Targets grew deeper, defenses fiercer, losses mounted, and the bomber crews whispered that every mission felt like a death sentence. It was into this crucible that Howard and his group were thrown. On the morning of January 11th, 1944, hundreds of bombers rose into the winter sky, engines droning in endless formation, bound for Oschersleben and Halberstadt. Their mission: to strike factories producing vital aircraft. For the Luftwaffe, the Germans could not allow such a blow unanswered, and fighters massed to intercept. Howard's unit was tasked with protecting one of the bomber wings. It would become the mission that defined his life. The day began cold and gray, frost clinging to wings, ground crews moving quickly to clear runways. Howard walked across the tarmac, helmet under his arm, his expression calm, though his mind raced through calculations. Fuel loads, rendezvous points, possible engagement zones. He spoke briefly with mechanics, checked his Mustang carefully, then climbed into the cockpit. The Merlin engine roared to life, vibrating through his bones. Steady and powerful, he glanced once at the sky, at the columns of bombers already climbing, and felt the weight of responsibility settle again. This was why he was here, to keep them alive. As the formation crossed the Channel, radios crackled with routine reports, positions confirmed, altitudes adjusted. Howard flew with his group until circumstances began to scatter them. Weather, timing, mechanical issues, all the friction of war. By the time the bombers reached central Germany, Howard found himself alone, his squadron stretched out, his Mustangs circling among hundreds of bombers with no wingmen at his side. And then the enemy came. From the northeast, German fighters appeared in waves, dozens of them climbing and diving with deadly intent. To the bomber crews, it seemed as if the sky itself was filling with predators, and in that moment, James Howell Howard made his decision. He would not leave them. The bombers were heavy shapes filling the sky, engines thundering in synchronized rhythm, contrails stretching across the pale German winter. Inside their formations, men sat tense at gun positions, scanning the horizon for the black crosses they knew would appear. When they saw the first wave of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing toward them, voices cracked over intercoms, guns swung into position, hearts pounded. They looked for the familiar silhouettes of Mustangs and Thunderbolts, the escort they depended on. But in that moment, only one fighter circled above them. One Mustang, its silver fuselage gleaming against the clouds, flown by James Howell Howard. He saw the swarm gathering and understood instantly the odds, 20, perhaps 30 fighters, more arriving every minute. Against that, he was alone. No wingman, no squadron, no relief in sight. Every instinct as a commander told him that survival meant withdrawal. That one Mustang could not stop such a tide. Yet another instinct, deeper, older, carried greater weight, the instinct of responsibility. Below him were hundreds of young men locked inside bombers. Men who could not maneuver, who could not escape. If he left them, many would die. If he stayed, he might die, but perhaps he could give him a chance. Howard tightened his grip on the stick, steadied his breathing, and made his choice. He dove. The Merlin engine roared. The Mustang's frame shuddered as he plunged into the path of the oncoming Germans. Tracers whipped past. Cannon shells burst nearby. But Howard held his line. He closed on the first FW-190, fired a short, disciplined burst, and watched the rounds tear into fuselage and wing. The fighter exploded in flame, tumbling from the sky. Even before it fell, he pulled into a climbing turn, evading return fire. Searching for his next target, the bombers cheered over radios, stunned that one fighter had thrown itself against the wave. Again he dove. Again he fired. Another enemy burst into flame. This time tracers tore past his canopy. Holes punched into his wings. But the Mustang still answered his commands. He rolled hard, came behind a 109, pressed the trigger, and saw it disintegrate. That was 3. The Germans pressed harder, swarming him, trying to cut him off, but Howard refused to yield. He fought with icy precision, never spraying wildly, never chasing hopelessly. Every shot was measured, every maneuver calculated. He was not reckless. He was relentless. For more than 30 minutes the duel raged. Bomber crews watched in awe as the lone Mustang slashed back and forth across the formation, engaging again and again, always returning to shield them. They counted kills, shouted encouragement. Some later admitted they thought they were hallucinating, that no single man could fight with such fury. But Howard was there, diving, climbing, striking, breaking the rhythm of the German assault. Each time fighters tried to press the bombers, he appeared, guns blazing, scattering them. He was like a shield of flesh and metal, interposing himself again and again against overwhelming numbers. By the time his ammunition was nearly gone, Howard had destroyed at least 5 enemy aircraft and damaged many more. Smoke trailed from his Mustang. Holes riddled its fuselage. Fuel ran low. Yet he still circled, refusing to abandon the bombers until the skies began to clear. When finally the German attack slackened, when the bombers pushed deeper toward their targets, he broke away, exhausted, shaking, but alive. Behind him, crews cheered, voices filling radios with disbelief and gratitude. They had witnessed something no one expected. One man against 30, refusing to yield. Later debriefings would record the chaos of that fight. Numbers disputed, claims cross-checked, but the essence was undeniable. James Howell Howard had stood alone between an entire bomber wing and annihilation. His actions saved countless lives, preserved the mission, and became legend even before he landed. Pilots who heard the reports shook their heads in amazement. Bomber crews swore they had seen a guardian angel. Howard himself said little, downplaying his role, insisting that he had done only what duty required. But those who had been there knew better. They had seen courage in its purest form, courage measured not in words, but in action. When Howard landed his Mustang on the battered English airfield that winter afternoon, the ground crews ran to meet him. They saw holes punched through his wings, the smoke stains trailing across the fuselage, the empty gun ports that had spat every round he carried. He climbed down slowly, exhaustion etched in every movement, and answered their questions with the same calm that had defined him in the air. He had fought because he could not do otherwise. He did not boast, did not smile, did not dramatize. He simply stated that the bombers had needed him and he had stayed. For him, that was explanation enough. The bomber crews told a different story. When they returned to their bases, shaken and weary, they spoke in astonished voices of the single Mustang that had fought like an entire squadron. Their reports were filled with vivid detail. The lone silver fighter diving again and again, flames blossoming from German wings, enemy attacks broken by one man's fury. They swore that he had saved them, that without him their losses would have been catastrophic. Word spread quickly through debriefings, mess halls, and briefing rooms. Pilots and crews who had not been there listened in disbelief. Yet the accounts were consistent, overwhelming. James Howell Howard had done the impossible. Commanders investigated, expecting exaggeration, but the evidence was clear. Howard had engaged alone against at least 30 enemy fighters. He had destroyed multiple aircraft, disrupted repeated assaults, and refused to abandon his charges even when his ammunition was nearly gone. His superiors recognized that this was not merely skill, but valor beyond expectation. They forwarded recommendations for the highest honors. In the grim winter of 1944, when the air war over Europe hung in delicate balance, the story of one man's stand became a beacon. News reached American newspapers within days. Headlines declared him the lone fighter who shielded a bomber armada, the ace who refused to retreat. Articles described the battle in dramatic tones, turning the cold facts into legend. Readers across the United States devoured the story, seeing in it proof of American courage, proof that their sons in Europe fought not only with machines, but with hearts of iron. Families of bomber crews wrote letters of gratitude, some calling him the guardian of their boys, others simply thanking him for keeping fathers and brothers alive. The name James Howell Howard began to circulate far beyond airfields. The Army Air Forces prepared for ceremony. On June 27, 1944, in the presence of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, James Howell Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. He stood in crisp uniform, modest as ever, while Eisenhower praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. Photographs captured the moment. Howard steady, unsmiling, embodying the seriousness of a man who knew that honors did not erase losses. For him, the medal was not a personal triumph, but recognition of the duty every pilot carried. He accepted it in the name of those who fought and fell. The press amplified the image, publishing his portrait, retelling the story, elevating him into the pantheon of American heroes. Yet Howard himself remained reluctant to bask in fame. He returned to flying, to escort missions, to the daily grind of war. In private, he confided to friends that he felt uneasy being singled out. He knew many men had fought with equal courage, some without witnesses, some without survival. He respected their silence and sacrifice. But history is shaped not only by fairness, but by stories, and his story had captured imagination. For the bomber crews, the medal felt personal. Men who had been inside those B-17s wrote later that the ceremony validated their memories, that the world now believed what they had seen. They spoke of Howard as the man who gave them life, the man who kept them from burning over Germany. Their gratitude endured for decades, shaping reunions and memoirs. His name was spoken with reverence, not as legend distant from reality, but as comrade who had stood between them and death. Even among allies, his act drew admiration. British commanders who had long doubted daylight bombing campaigns pointed to Howard's stand as evidence of American resolve. Soviet reports, though cautious, noted the courage of the lone pilot. Within the Luftwaffe, captured German pilots admitted respect, some shaking their heads at the madness of one man challenging so many yet acknowledging the discipline it required. In war, respect between enemies is rare, but Howard earned it. The Medal of Honor did not change his demeanor. He remained the calm, analytical man he had always been, focused on duty rather than glory. Yet it did change how others saw him. Younger pilots looked to him as example. Journalists sought him for interviews. Commanders used his story to inspire. He bore the weight with quiet dignity, never letting pride overtake humility. His motives had not been medals or fame. His motives had been the bombers, the men inside them, and the duty he could not abandon. After the ceremony, James Howell Howard returned to his squadron with little change in his routine. The medal glittered briefly in headlines, but the war still demanded missions every week, long hours in the cockpit, endless escorts over hostile skies. Howard remained a commander, not a celebrity. He briefed his men, drilled them in discipline, and led them into combat with the same steady voice on the radio. The younger pilots stared at him differently now, seeing not only their leader, but a living legend. Yet he discouraged hero worship. He insisted they focus on formation, fuel, angles of attack. To him, survival was not built on inspiration alone, but on precision and control. Still, the shadow of his great battle followed him. Bomber crews looked for his Mustang, whispering with relief when they saw it weaving above them. Some admitted that they believed no German would dare attack while he was present, as if his very presence bent fate. Howard smiled politely at such remarks, but carried them heavily. He knew that courage was not immunity, that every mission carried risk no medal could erase. He saw friends die, Mustangs lost in fire, bombers falling in pieces. He accepted that his own time might come, and he flew with that knowledge without letting it harden him. His motives deepened in those months. He thought often of the men inside bombers, their faces pressed against windows, their lives entrusted to the shield of fighters. He knew how fragile they were in the air, heavy machines that could not dodge, could not run. Protecting them became more than mission. It became his cause. Each fortress that limped home with smoke trailing felt like victory greater than any kill. Each time a pilot from a bomber shook his hand and thanked him, he felt purpose. Renewed, he did not fight for medals or records. He fought for them. The missions grew harder as Germany tightened defenses. Luftwaffe units still launched desperate counterattacks, throwing inexperienced boys into cockpits, sometimes in overwhelming numbers. Anti-aircraft fire thickened, filling the skies with black bursts that hammered bombers and escorts alike. Howard guided his men through it, sometimes speaking calmly over radio while flak shattered around them, reminding them to hold formation, to trust their training. His composure steadied them, even when engines flamed or comrades vanished. Yet beneath the calm, Howard carried strain. Nights were restless, haunted by images of burning planes, by the faces of those he could not save. He rarely spoke of fear, but it lived inside him. What sustained him was duty, the sense that as long as he flew, others had a chance. Some pilots sought relief in bravado, boasting in bars, but Howard preferred quiet, preferring to listen more than talk. He wrote letters with restraint, never describing horrors in detail, shielding his family from the truth. His silence was not coldness, but protection, the same instinct that guided him in combat. As 1945 approached, the tide of war shifted visibly. Bombers reached deeper into Germany. Targets burned, rail lines collapsed, oil refineries vanished under waves of destruction. The Luftwaffe weakened, its veterans killed, its replacements barely trained. Missions grew less dangerous, yet no less exhausting, for the skies still held flak and ambushes. Howard noticed the change, sensed the enemy fading, yet he refused to grow careless. He reminded his men that desperation made opponents more dangerous, that even cornered foes could kill. His caution saved lives as always. In private moments, he reflected on his path, from childhood in China to Navy training, from flying tigers over Asia to bombers over Europe. His life had been defined by flight and war. He wondered sometimes what peace would mean, whether he could ever leave the cockpit behind. The roar of engines had become the rhythm of his life, the endless horizon his constant companion. Yet he also longed for quiet, for an end to the relentless strain. He dreamed of skies free of contrails and fire, of flying not as weapon, but as freedom. By the time victory neared, Howard had become not only a hero, but a symbol of American air power. Journalists still sought him, commanders praised him, but he deflected attention. He knew that the true story of the war was not one man's valor, but the collective endurance of thousands. He respected the mechanics who kept engines alive, the crews who flew into fire day after day, the families who waited at home. He considered himself part of that whole, not above it. His humility deepened the respect of those around him. When the war in Europe ended, Howard had flown dozens of missions, survived countless dangers, and carried the burden of leadership with dignity. He had become one of the few recipients of the Medal of Honor in the Army Air Forces. Yet he spoke little of it. To him, the medal represented responsibility, not glory. He wore it for the bomber crews he had saved, for the comrades he had lost, for the civilians he had once seen suffering in China. His motives had always been the same: to protect, to endure, to fight not for himself, but for others. That was the core of James Howell Howard, and that was why his story would live on. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, James Howell Howard had already lived several lifetimes in one. He had been a Navy pilot, a flying tiger, a squadron leader, a lone defender above Germany, a Medal of Honor recipient. Yet as the world shifted from war to uneasy peace, he faced the question every soldier eventually confronts. What now? For years his purpose had been singular, defined by missions, targets, and duty. Suddenly the skies grew quiet. Bombers no longer climbed in endless formations. Engines no longer roared across English fields. The silence was almost unsettling. Howard returned to the United States to acclaim. Newspapers greeted him as hero. Parades celebrated his courage. Communities shook his hand with reverence. Yet he felt detached from the fanfare. He had not fought for applause, and he carried memories that did not align with celebrations. He thought of friends who had not returned, of young pilots lost in fire, of bomber crews who never saw home again. The cheers reminded him of their absence more than his triumph. He accepted honors with humility, speaking of duty rather than glory, reminding audiences that victory was collective, never individual. After leaving active combat, he continued to serve in various capacities, sharing his experience, shaping future generations of pilots. He understood that the lessons of the war were not only technical but moral. He spoke often of responsibility, of protecting those more vulnerable, of courage measured not by aggression, but by sacrifice. Cadets who listened to him absorbed more than tactics. They absorbed an ethic. For Howard, leadership was not about medals or rank, but about steady presence. When fear threatened to overwhelm. In civilian life, he sought peace. He worked in aviation administration, guiding projects, shaping policy, applying his discipline to building rather than destroying. He rarely spoke of his famous battle. Though when asked, he recounted it with restraint, focusing not on his kills, but on his motives. He emphasized the bombers, the men inside, the reason he had stayed. He told listeners that the moment of decision had not felt heroic, but necessary. That honesty made his story more powerful than embellishment ever could. Privately, he wrestled with memory. Nightmares visited him, as they did many veterans. Images of burning planes and falling comrades. He learned to live with them, channeling his energy into work and family. He spoke of the war only when pressed, and even then with simplicity. To him, the past was heavy, but he carried it quietly, never allowing bitterness to harden him. He believed that survival carried obligation, to live well, to honor the dead through dignity. His Medal of Honor remained a symbol, but not a possession he flaunted. He kept it with care, brought it out for ceremonies, lent it weight when honoring others. But in his home, it was simply one object among many. He valued not the medal, but what it represented. The bond between him and the crews he had saved, the trust they had placed in him, the duty he had fulfilled. He sometimes met with those men, shared stories, laughed at memories, mourned those missing. Their gratitude humbled him more than any parade. As years passed, his story entered history books, documentaries, museums. Children learned of the lone Mustang that shielded an entire bomber wing. Aviation enthusiasts studied his tactics. Historians praised his courage. Yet Howard himself resisted myth. He insisted he had been one man among many, that countless acts of bravery had gone unrecorded. He reminded audiences that war was not glory but tragedy, that every medal was written in blood, His humility preserved the authenticity of his legend. In later life, he lived quietly. Respected in both military and civilian circles, he embodied the paradox of heroism. A man who had performed an extraordinary act, yet sought no extraordinary attention. His friends described him as steady, thoughtful, kind. His colleagues admired his discipline, his integrity. Those who knew his story admired his humility most of all. He never allowed the legend to eclipse the man, never allowed fame to distort truth. He remained what he had always been, a pilot who accepted responsibility, a leader who placed others before himself, a man who chose to stay when leaving was easier. James Howell Howard passed away in 1995, leaving behind a legacy written not only in records, but in lives saved. Bomber crews who had once looked upward and seen his Mustang still remembered him as the guardian who refused to abandon them. Historians remembered him as the only fighter pilot in the European theater of operations to receive the Medal of Honor. Fellow aviators remembered him as a model of calm courage. His name endures because it represents something timeless, the moment when one individual, faced with impossible odds, chooses duty over fear. The story of James Howell Howard is more than history. It is a reminder that war tests not only nations but individuals, that courage is not absence of fear but refusal to yield to it, that leadership is not command but example. His decision on that cold January day in 1944 did not alter the outcome of the war, but it preserved lives, it inspired comrades. It demonstrated the power of one man's resolve. That is why his name still resonates, why his legend still inspires, in the roar of his Mustang's Merlin engine, in the tracers that lit the sky, in the bombers that survived because he stayed. We hear not just the story of a pilot, but the story of responsibility fulfilled.